Has ever done a farewell tour and not come back?
It's like, you know, the farewell stuff, I'm sure that everybody on the planet, when they hear that farewell thing, goes like, oh, I know what that's about. They'll get back together in a few years, jack up ticket sales.
Okay, so let me ask you something before we even get started. What if the band you grew up blasting through busted car speakers, the band that basically made rebellion look like a career path, what if a lot of it wasn't real? Not just the stage makeup, not just the pyrotechnics, but the stories, the reputation, the image, even the lineup. What if Motley Crüe, arguably the most infamous rock band to ever walk out of Hollywood, built a significant chunk of their legend on carefully manufactured lies? Because here's the thing, fans are finding out, and the more people dig, the messier it gets. We're talking a lawsuit that ended with a founding member being forced to admit under oath that he lied. We're talking a memoir that even the people who wrote it now say might be greatly embellished or made up. We're talking about a final farewell tour that wasn't, and a band whose satanic, dangerous, too wild for TV image was, you ready for this? A marketing strategy. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you are going to look at Motley Crüe in a completely different way. And honestly, some of it is fascinating, some of it is kind of sad, and some of it is just embarrassing. Welcome to Hidden Fame Files. Let's get into it. So here's where we need to start, because to understand the full scope of what's been uncovered about Motley Crüe, you first need to understand what the legend was supposed to be. 4 guys, wild as hell, dangerous, interchangeable? Never. The classic Motley Crüe lineup was sacred. Vince Neil on vocals, Mick Mars on guitar, Nikki Sixx on bass, Tommy Lee on drums. That was the story. That was the brand. 4 misfits from the gutter who somehow took over the world and never, ever changed. Except they did change. Quite a bit, actually. Here's something a lot of newer fans don't realize, and even some longtime fans sort of glossed over. Motley Crüe has had more lineup changes than their carefully curated image would ever have you believe. During the mid-90s, Vince Neil left the band, or was fired, depending on who's telling the story that day, and was replaced by a guy named John Corabi. Now, Corabi is a genuinely talented musician, and the self-titled 1994 Motley Crüe album he recorded with them is actually getting reevaluated by fans who are going back and listening with fresh ears. At the time, mixed reviews. Fans were confused, purists were furious, but the album existed, and it was real Motley Crüe music, just not the lineup you were sold. And it didn't stop there. Drummer Tommy Lee had his own gap in the band's history. During his legal troubles in the late 90s, the band brought in not 1, but 2 different replacements, Randy Castillo and later Samantha Maloney, who is genuinely underappreciated in this whole story. These weren't minor blips, these were years, but somehow the Motley Crüe mythology machine just smoothed right over them. Why does that matter? Because the band spent decades presenting themselves as this unbreakable unit, 4 originals, together forever, no compromises. It was part of the mythos. It was central to the story they were selling. And the actual reality was a lot more fluid than any of that. Now, pause here, because I want you to ask yourself something. How many bands do you know that have had multiple lineup changes, but still get presented to the public as if they never did? Drop that in the comments. I'm genuinely curious whether you think lineup changes should matter for a band's legacy, or whether the music speaks for itself. All right, let's talk about the member who has been in the news the most recently, and whose story is honestly one of the most complicated and kind of heartbreaking parts of this whole saga. Mick Mars. On the surface, Mick Mars was always the quiet one, the mysterious one, the guy standing at the edge of the stage while Vince was belting and Tommy was spinning on the drum riser the size of a small aircraft carrier. Mars just stood there, looked cool, played his parts. Nobody really dug too deep into his personal life because the other 3 members were generating enough headlines for the whole band combined. But here's what was happening behind that stoic exterior. Mars had been battling a condition called ankylosing spondylitis, a severe, progressive form of spinal arthritis, for most of his adult life. Not just throughout the later years, we're talking decades of chronic pain, worsening mobility, and a condition that fuses the vertebrae over time. Every night on stage, every tour, every show, he was in genuine, serious pain. And then there's the mental health side of things. Reports and interviews over the years have suggested Mars dealt with significant mental health challenges, including schizophrenia, struggles that were almost entirely buried beneath the band's party-hard image and the non-stop chaos generated by his bandmates. It was easier and better for the brand to let Mick be the quiet one. His actual suffering, that was a lot less marketable. The thing is, you could argue that the band's image itself contributed to hiding all of this, because when your whole reputation is built on being larger than life and indestructible, there's no room in that story for chronic illness, pain, or vulnerability. The persona swallowed the person. And in Mick Mars's case, for a very long time, the outside world barely noticed. Now, and here's where things get genuinely wild. Fast forward to 2022. Mars announces he's retiring from touring, citing his worsening health. Fair enough, right? The man had given everything he had physically to this band for decades. Totally understandable. Except what happened next, nobody saw coming. Mars filed a lawsuit, a big one. He alleged that after his retirement announcement, the rest of Mötley Crüe tried to push him out of the band's corporate structure entirely, out of his 25% stake in the company. He claimed they tried to erase him financially as well as musically. And then, and this is the part that blew up all over rock media, he accused Nikki Sixx of not playing a single live note on bass during the 2022 stadium tour. He claimed backing tracks were carrying the whole thing. Now that is a serious accusation. That's not they changed their setlist territory. That's essentially calling the whole live show fake. Nikki Sixx responded publicly and furiously, calling it a betrayal. The band lawyered up hard. The legal battle dragged on for years. And then, in January of 2026, just a few months ago as this video is being made, an independent arbitrator ruled decisively in favor of Mötley Crüe. Mars was ordered to repay a portion of the advance money he received for shows he didn't perform. And here is the part that stopped people in their tracks. Mars was forced to admit under oath that his statements about backing tracks were false. His own expert witness, the guy Mars himself hired, who reviewed hours of tour footage, confirmed the band was performing live. Mars formally recanted his claims during sworn testimony. Now look, we're not here to pile on Mick Mars. The man is genuinely ill, and some of what happened behind the scenes sounds legitimately painful and unfair. But the fact that this ended with a founding member having to retract statements he'd made publicly under oath in front of a legal arbitrator, that tells you something about how messy the truth around this band has always been, even for the members themselves. And that brings us to the chapter of this story that might be the most revealing of all. I want to take a second right here, because if you're finding this content interesting, the real stories behind the legends, this is exactly what we do on Hidden Fame Files. We go past the Wikipedia summary. We go past the official narrative. If that sounds like your kind of thing, do me a favor right now and hit that subscribe button, because we've got a lot more of this kind of deep dive coming. And hey, if you're watching on a platform that has the hype button, tap it. Seriously, it's the new way to tell the algorithm that you want more content like this, and it actually helps channels like ours more than you might think. It takes 2 seconds, and it makes a real difference. Appreciate you. Okay, the memoir. We have to talk about The Dirt. When The Dirt was published back in 2001, it was treated like the rock and roll Bible, the most honest, raw, unfiltered account of a band ever committed to paper. It was shocking. It was outrageous. It was, and this is the word that got used over and over, confessional. Then Netflix turned it into a movie in 2019, introduced the whole story to a new generation, and suddenly The Dirt was everywhere again. A new generation of Mötley Crüe fans treated it as gospel. Here's the problem. Multiple stories in that book have since been disputed, fact-checked, or outright contradicted, sometimes by the very people who wrote them. Let's start with Nikki Sixx himself. There's a story in the dirt involving a woman at a party and a deeply disturbing encounter. When this was re-examined years later, particularly in the context of the Me Too conversations happening around 2019, Sixx publicly said, and I'm going to be careful here to give you the essence of this without getting into unnecessary detail, that he does not actually recall that story beyond reading it in the book. His words were that it was possibly greatly embellished or made up. His explanation? He was heavily on drugs during the interviews with the ghostwriter, Neil Strauss, and doesn't remember much of that period. Let that land for a moment. The memoir that was sold as raw, honest truth, one of the authors is now saying parts of it might be fabricated, and his defense is essentially that he was too out of it to know what he was saying. But it doesn't stop there. Journalists and rock historians who went through the dirt and the Netflix movie with a fine-tooth comb found story after story that didn't hold up. The way Vince Neil was supposedly recruited, different in reality. The story of how they got their record deal, more complicated and less cinematic than presented. The timeline of key events, compressed and rearranged to make for a better story. Even something as basic as their original lead singer, a guy named Odin Peterson, who was with the band before Vince Neil, was essentially erased from the official Motley Crue story entirely. Not a mention, not a footnote, gone. Now, to be fair, and I do want to be fair here, rock memoirs are not sworn testimony. They're stories. Everyone who writes one is going to remember events differently, combine timelines, and emphasize the dramatic moments. That's the genre. Even great memoirs by beloved artists take liberties. So is some of this understandable? Sure. But here's what makes The Dirt different. It was presented with this whole aggressive posture of, we're telling you everything, nothing held back. This is the raw, unvarnished truth. That was the sales pitch. That was the identity of the book. And when the raw truth turns out to have significant chunks that were potentially made up by people who admit they don't remember them, the brand promise falls apart a bit. And speaking of brand promises, we need to talk about the biggest one of all. Satanic, evil, too dangerous for radio, too wild for prime time. That was Motley Crüe in the early days. Pentagrams on the album covers, skull imagery everywhere. Nikki Sixx looking like he'd just crawled out of an actual occult ritual. The parents of America were genuinely concerned. The PMRC, that's the Parental Music Resource Center, for those of you who remember Tipper Gore, had Motley Crüe squarely in their crosshairs as a corrupting force on America's youth. It was perfect, absolutely perfect, because here's what it was marketing. Almost none of it reflected the band's actual beliefs. The satanic imagery was a calculated shock tactic designed specifically to get attention, generate controversy, and make Motley Crüe impossible to ignore in a crowded hard rock marketplace. It worked brilliantly, but it wasn't real. And the band, particularly Nikki Sixx, who was the primary architect of the Crue's image and presentation, has been relatively open about this over the years, though usually in contexts that don't make the biggest headlines. The bad boy persona, the dangerous reputation, the sense that these were genuinely unhinged people who lived by no rules. It was a crafted narrative, a product, one that served the record label, served the band, and sold a lot of concert tickets. Now, again, is this uniquely terrible? Not really. Rock and roll has always had a theatrical element. Alice Cooper built an entire career on theatrical horror that had nothing to do with his actual life. Kiss literally invented personas and stuck to them for decades. Image crafting is part of the music industry. But, and here's the but, Motley Crüe sold themselves specifically as the authentic version, the real thing. Not theatrical, not safe rock with dangerous makeup, actually dangerous, actually out of control. The Dirt itself was built on the idea that this was what really happened. And when you learn that a significant portion of the most memorable elements were manufactured for maximum impact, it reframes everything. Here's a question I want you to sit with and maybe drop an answer to in the comments. Does it change how you feel about a band when you find out their image was carefully constructed rather than natural? Like, does it matter to you? Because I think the answers people give say a lot about what we actually value in rock music. Now let's talk about something that happened more recently, and honestly, it might be the most on-the-nose example of everything we've been discussing. The 2015 final tour. Motley Crue announced they were breaking up. Done. Finished. And not just with a press release, they signed an actual legal document called a cessation agreement. This was the band going out of their way to make a concrete, legally binding promise to their fans that this was it. No comebacks, no cash grab reunion tours. If any of them ever performed as Motley Crue again without all 4 original members present and willing, they'd face serious financial penalties. They made a whole event out of signing it in front of cameras. There were speeches. It was treated as this landmark moment of integrity, a band refusing to do what so many legacy acts do, which is milk the farewell tour into eternity. And then they came back. New music, new tours, without Mick Mars, with his replacement John 5 on guitar. Now, the band's position is that the cessation agreement was invalidated or modified when Mars retired from touring, and that they've worked through the legal framework properly. That may well be true from a strictly contractual standpoint, but here's the thing. The spirit of that moment in 2015, the whole point was to look their fans in the eye and say, "We mean this." And the reality of what followed has made that gesture look, at minimum, less meaningful than it was presented to be. The pattern across everything we've talked about today is exactly this. There's the story Motley Crue wants you to believe, and then there's the more complicated, less flattering, but much more interesting reality underneath it. So, where does all of this leave us? Here's my honest take, for whatever it's worth. Motley Crue made genuinely great records. Shout at the Devil is a classic. Theater of Pain hits differently. Dr. Feelgood is a masterpiece of its genre, full stop. The music is real, and the music holds up. Nobody's taking that away from them. But the mythology, the legend, the story of who they are and what they stand for, that has always been at least partly a manufactured product. The image was constructed, the memoir was embellished, the lineup fluidity was smoothed over. The health struggles of real human beings, particularly Mick Mars, were buried beneath a party narrative that served the brand. And when it came time to keep their most public promise to fans, the legalities won out over the symbolism. What's interesting is that this doesn't make them unique. This makes them like virtually every major rock act of that era. Almost everyone was constructing a version of themselves for public consumption. But Motley Crue's whole identity was built on the claim that they weren't doing that they were the real thing in a world of phonies. And that's what makes the gap between the story and the reality so worth examining. Here's the last thing I'll say, and I want you to think about this one. Is there something almost admirable about how effectively they pulled it off? Decades of a carefully maintained mythology, surviving lineup changes, addiction scandals, legal battles, a lawsuit from a founding member, and one of the most scrutinized memoirs in rock history. And Motley Crue is still here, still selling tickets, still relevant enough to generate headlines in 2026. Maybe the real story isn't that they lied. Maybe the real story is that they understood something most bands never figure out. The story you tell is sometimes more powerful than the truth underneath it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Were you already aware of any of this? Or did something in this video catch you off guard? I read every comment, genuinely. If you made it this far, thanks. Really. This is exactly the kind of deep dive we love doing here at Hidden Fame Files. If this hit different for you, the like button is right there. It takes 1 second and it actually tells the algorithm that this kind of content is worth pushing to people who'd appreciate it. And subscribe if you haven't yet, because we're not done pulling on these threads. There's a lot more where this came from. See you in the next one.